Meantime, both U.S. and Russian officials are downplaying reports that dozens of Russian mercenaries were killed trying to attack a U.S. base in Syria.
The Russians were reportedly taken out by U.S. airstrike repelling the attack. i24News senior defense correspondent Shai Ben-Ari has the latest.
A mysterious incident in Syria is digging up old fears from the past. Dozens of Russian fighters are now believed to have been killed in clashes between pro-regime forces in Syria and U.S.-led coalition forces. This fighting took place on February 7th and 8th, and some reports leaking from different Russian sources are now saying over 200 Russian nationals were killed in the clashes, which took place near Al-Tabiya in Syria's east. Despite this, it's unclear whether official Russian authorities were involved.
The pro-regime force, for some reason, without apparently telling the Russians, without coordinating with anybody, came across the river and then attacked us. So we will rebuff anyone who attacks us, obviously.
The Pentagon has since released this video, filmed in the same area last Saturday. The tank seen here is a Russian-made T-72. The U.S. military said the tank had fired at coalition forces and was then targeted by an American drone. Exactly who was inside the tank is unclear.
In my opinion, the Americans act not in a way of patient agreement, of common consent, but in a dangerous way and with unilateral steps. This more and more seems like a policy of undermining Syria's integrity.
A spokesman for the Kremlin has denied that any official Russian service members were involved in this fighting, but also added, "We don't have data about other Russians who could be in Syria." Private Russian military companies are known to operate in Syrian territory. One example is an organization known as the Wagner Group. These companies and various pro-Russian militias have also played a role in the fighting in Ukraine over recent years. The U.S. and Russia have come close to direct conflict before in Syria. Last April, American cruise missiles hit Syria's Shariat airbase in retaliation for a chemical weapons attack committed by the regime. This despite Russian forces being present at the facility. Still, it seems both sides are looking to de-escalate.
We're not going to broaden the war, or that's not in our interest. There will be no mission creep.
Many hope that Syria's long and brutal civil war will not reignite an old conflict gone cold. Shai Ben-Ari, i24 News.
And let's bring in Craig Snyder. He's the president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Craig, both sides are downplaying this, but is it going to spiral into something bigger?
Well, it could. I don't think it's likely because this doesn't appear to have been an operation that was coordinated or controlled by the Kremlin and by the Russian military in an official way. These private contractors, mercenaries, many of them appear to be really ultra-nationalist zealots, also ultra-committed to their version of the Orthodox Christian Church. And they were fighting alongside, and in many respects leading, pro-Assad Syrian Christians who view themselves, beset on all sides by the Muslim majority in Syria. So this may well have been a kind of a rogue operation. The United States had to respond and did so forcefully and effectively. It hopefully will not escalate beyond that because the Russian government was not behind it.
Craig, could it still put an enormous amount of pressure, though, on the Russian government just because of domestic Russian politics, that as the Russian public sees, oh, perhaps as many as 200 Russians were killed, even if they were mercenaries, they were still Russians who were killed at the hands of the United States?
Well, that's possible, but the Russian government seems to be doing everything it can to have ordinary Russians not hear that news that you just reported. The official commentary in Russian-controlled media, which is largely the only media that people have access to, is really downplaying this. And they're talking about, perhaps a handful of Russians being involved. They're talking about not knowing who's there and how many are there and how many have been injured. The limited political opposition to Putin in Russia is trying to make a point about this, but it's very hard for them to be heard inside that very controlled country at this point.
There were reports that a Russian tank was used in the attack against the U.S. base. If the Russian army wasn't involved, how did these mercenaries get their hands on a Russian tank?
Well, these kind of paramilitary operations, and sometimes this goes for American private military contractors as well, that have been used in Afghanistan and Iraq. They can have very sophisticated equipment. It's not the latest generation equipment, but it's sort of surplus, slightly older, still very lethal equipment. It's certainly not impossible that that could have happened without the direct provision of the Russian military.
And Craig, real quickly in the 30 seconds we have left, what do you make of Nikki Haley at the United Nations lashing out at both Iran and Russia as far as the destabilization that continues in Syria?
Well, the administration as a whole may not have a consistent policy on these things, but Nikki Haley appears to have one. She has been consistent about these things over and over, decrying the wave after wave of war crimes being committed by the Iranians and the Russians and the Syrian government against the Syrian people.
All right, Craig Snyder, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, thanks for coming back on our show.
Absolutely. Thank you.